You are sitting on a boulder in a dry creek bed at the back of the Spahn Movie Ranch in the Santa Susana Pass 30 miles northwest of Los Angeles on the warm afternoon of August 8th, 1969. You are 34 years old. You are 5 feet 2 inches tall and you weigh 121 pounds. You are wearing dirty denim trousers and an unbuttoned white work shirt, and you have grown your hair to your shoulders and a thin beard halfway down your chest. There are 9 young women living in the bunkhouse behind you. 3 of them have already been informed, an hour ago, that tonight is the night Helter Skelter begins. The 3 women, accompanied by 1 young man you have personally selected, will leave the ranch at 11:30 in the evening, and they will drive 42 minutes in a stolen 1959 Ford to a house at 1050 Cielo Drive in the Benedict Canyon neighborhood of Los Angeles. They will, by 3 o'clock the next morning, have killed 5 people in that house. One of them will be 26 years old and pregnant. By the end of the next afternoon, you will have ordered the killing of 2 more people in a house in Los Feliz. By the end of 1970, you will be in a county jail wearing your own initials carved into your forehead. By 1972, the names of those 9 murders will be on the front page of every newspaper in America. This is your life as Charles Milles Manson. You are born on November 12, 1934, in the maternity ward of General Hospital in Cincinnati, Ohio. Your mother is 16 years old. Her name is Kathleen Maddox. She is a heavy drinker, a part-time prostitute, and a small-time thief. Your father, on every official document of your life, is recorded as a man named Colonel Walker Henderson Scott Sr., who never met your mother in person, and who is not, in fact, a colonel of anything. Your mother trades you, on 3 separate occasions before your 5th birthday, to women in the bars of Indianapolis in exchange for jugs of beer. Each of these women, briefly believing herself to be your new mother, brings you home, decides she has been deceived, and returns you the following morning to your actual mother in the same bar. Your earliest memory, you will tell a Vacaville prison psychiatrist in 1971, is the smell of cigarettes and gin in the back booth of the bar where these transactions are conducted. Your mother is sentenced in 1939 to 5 years in the West Virginia Penitentiary for armed robbery. You are 5 years old. You are sent to live with an aunt and uncle in Moundsville, West Virginia. The aunt is kind. The uncle is a violent fundamentalist Baptist who beats you with a leather strap for what he calls effeminate behavior, by which he means crying. Your mother is paroled in 1942. She comes for you. She takes you to Indianapolis. You are 8. You are entered into the 3rd grade of a public school where, the school records will note, you are quiet and well-mannered and unable to focus. You begin to commit small thefts at the age of 9. You begin to commit larger ones at 12. You are sent in 1947 to the Gibeau School for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana, a Catholic reformatory for the children of the homeless and the abandoned. You escape in 3 days. You are returned. You escape in 7. You are returned. By the age of 15, you have escaped from 4 different state reformatories in 3 different states. You will be incarcerated by the time of your release in 1954 for 54 months of your first 19 years. You will tell, in 1968, a young Hollywood blonde named Lynette Fromm, who has just begun calling herself Squeaky, that you have spent more of your life in cages than out of them. She will believe you. She will be telling the truth. You arrive in Los Angeles in March 1967 on parole from McNeil Island Federal Penitentiary in Washington State. You are 32 years old. You have, in McNeil Island, learned to play the steel-string acoustic guitar from a fellow inmate named Alvin Karpis, who once ran the Barker Karpis gang in the 1930s. You have, in McNeil Island, also begun to study the sermons of the Process Church of the Final Judgment, the writings of L. Ron Hubbard, the Book of Revelation, and a Robert Heinlein novel called Stranger in a Strange Land. You arrive in Los Angeles believing yourself to be Jesus Christ. The belief will, over the next 2 years, become one of the easier sales of your life. You meet, on the afternoon of March 24th, 1967, on the corner of Haight and Ashbury in San Francisco, a young woman named Mary Brunner. She is a 23-year-old University of California, Berkeley library assistant. You sing to her for 35 minutes on the sidewalk in front of a head shop. You move into her apartment that night. You tell her, on the second night, that the only reason her life has had no meaning until this point is that she has not yet given it to you. She gives it to you. She is the first. You meet, in April 1968, a 23-year-old drummer named Dennis Wilson, who is the youngest of the three Wilson brothers of the Beach Boys and who is, in 1968, at the height of his fame and of his unhappiness. He picks up two of your young women hitchhiking on the Pacific Coast Highway. They tell him about you. He invites them home for dinner. They bring you. He plays you, that night, two of his own demos. You play him three of your songs. He invites you and your women to move into the back room of his Pacific Palisades log cabin on Sunset Boulevard. You move in within 48 hours. The household includes, by midsummer of 1968, you and 17 of your women, Dennis Wilson, his estranged wife, and a rotating cast of recording engineers, drug dealers, and underage runaway girls from the Hollywood Boulevard sidewalks. You and your women cost Dennis Wilson, in the summer of 1968, an estimated $100,000 in stolen property, hospital bills for venereal disease, and a wrecked Mercedes. He throws you out in August 1968. He keeps, however, one of your songs. The song is called Cease to Exist. He records it in October 1968 with the Beach Boys. He retitles it Never Learn Not to Love. He releases it as the B-side of the single Bluebirds Over the Mountain in December 1968. He removes your name from the songwriting credit and substitutes his own. You will, in 1969, remind him of this fact in a brief telephone call. He will hang up on you. You will not be in the same room with him again. He will live the rest of his life, you will be told later by a Beach Boys road manager, with a loaded pistol in his bedside table. By the end of 1967, you have collected, around the cracked windshield of a stolen black 1959 Ford school bus, painted in psychedelic colors, 18 young women between the ages of 14 and 24. You drive the bus, in the spring of 1968, into the dry creek beds of the Santa Susana Pass at the western edge of Los Angeles County. You park the bus on the property of an 80-year-old former cowboy actor named George Spahn, who is, by 1968, almost completely blind, and who runs a derelict movie ranch, where he rents out horses for $10 an hour to weekend tourists. You offer Spahn, in exchange for permanent residence on the property for you and your 18 women, the sexual services of 3 of them on a rotating schedule. He accepts the arrangement. The arrangement will hold for 16 months. Spahn will, in 1969, be questioned by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department on 3 separate occasions. He will refuse every time to evict you. He will tell the deputies that you and the women are good people who help him with the horses. You begin, in the summer of 1968, to preach to your 18 women a doctrine you call Helter Skelter. The doctrine has been pieced together from the Book of Revelation, the Process Church, and a Beatles album that has just been released called The White Album. Helter Skelter, you preach, is the inevitable race war between black and white America that will, in the coming year, leave the entire white population of California dead. You and your 18 women will, you preach, survive Helter Skelter by retreating into a bottomless cavern beneath Death Valley that you have personally located on a survey map. You will emerge from the cavern after the war is over to inherit the surface of the earth. The black population, you preach, will not be able to govern the empty country. They will, you preach, ask you to come out and rule them. You will rule them, you and the 18 women. The 18 women on the bus are, by the autumn of 1968, the most well-fed and least clothed group of teenage runaways in the state of California. They are referred to, by themselves and by you, as the family. Their names will, in the next 18 months, become known to every newspaper reader in America. Susan Atkins is 20. She is from a broken home in San Jose. She has been a topless dancer in San Francisco. Patricia Krenwinkel is 21. She is from a middle-class home in Mobile, Alabama. She has been a Sunday school teacher. Lynette Fromm is 20. She is from Westchester County, New York. She has been a high school cheerleader. Linda Kasabian is 20. She is from New Hampshire. She has just left her second husband. Sandra Good is 25. She is the daughter of a San Diego stockbroker. Mary Brunner is 23. She is the librarian. Each of these women, you have learned by the autumn of 1968, can be brought to a state of unconditional surrender by a particular combination of small kindnesses, intermittent cruelty, marathon group LSD sessions, and a sermon delivered in the dry creek bed at 3 a.m. while you are personally naked. The combination is reproducible. You apply it 18 separate times. You are introduced in the spring of 1968 to a young record producer named Terry Melcher. Melcher is the son of the Hollywood actress Doris Day. Melcher is, in 1968, 30 years old, and at the height of his record-producing career. You play him 3 of your songs in his rented house at 150 Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon. He listens. He tells you gently that he will not be producing your record. You leave the house. You return to Spahn Ranch. You tell the 18 women that night that Terry Melcher is a coward and that he has betrayed the only true Christ on earth. You will not see Terry Melcher again. He will, in February 1969, vacate the Cielo Drive house. The house will be rented in March 1969 to a Polish film director named Roman Polanski and his 25-year-old wife, the actress Sharon Tate. You order, on the night of August 8, 1969, your principal, Lieutenant Charles Tex Watson, age 23, to take 3 women, Susan Atkins, 21, Patricia Krenwinkel, 21, and Linda Kasabian, 20, to the house at 105 Cielo Drive, and to kill everyone they find inside. You give the order in the central kitchen of Spahn Ranch at 11:30. You do not, you will tell investigators in 1970, expect Sharon Tate to be in the house. You expect Terry Melcher. The 4 leave the ranch at 11:35. They drive 42 minutes. They cut the telephone wire at the gate. They scale the fence. They walk up the long driveway. They encounter first a young man named Stephen Parent, who has been visiting the property's caretaker. They shoot him 4 times in his Rambler in the driveway. They walk into the main house through a window. They find Sharon Tate, 8.5 months pregnant. They find her friend Jay Sebring, the celebrity hairdresser. They find the screenwriter Wojciech Frykowski. They find the coffee heiress Abigail Folger. They kill all 4 of them in the next 45 minutes. They write the word pig in Sharon Tate's blood on the front door. They drive home. They burn their clothes in a ravine. They report to you in the kitchen at 4 a.m. You ask, you will later say, only one question. The question is whether they were neat about it. They tell you they were not. You drive the next afternoon to a small house at 3301 Waverly Drive in Los Feliz, where a 44-year-old supermarket executive named Leno LaBianca lives with his wife Rosemary. You and your lieutenants tie them up. You walk back to your car. Your lieutenants kill them inside the house in the next 30 minutes. They write the words, "Death to Pigs" and "Helter Skelter," the second word misspelled, in Leno LaBianca's blood on the wall. You are arrested on October 12th, 1969, at the remote Barker Ranch in the southern end of Death Valley on charges of grand theft auto. You are 45 days into a planned indefinite stay in the cavern beneath Death Valley, which has, of course, never existed. You are not, at the time of your arrest, suspected by any law enforcement agency in the state of California of being involved in the Tate or LaBianca murders. The connection will not be made for another 62 days, and only when one of the 18 women, Susan Atkins, who has been arrested separately on a different charge, confesses to a cellmate at the Sybil Brand Institute for Women. The connection is made on December 1st, 1969. The Los Angeles Police Department, working through the night, links Susan Atkins's confession to the physical evidence at the Cielo Drive house. The crime laboratory matches her fingerprints, lifted from the front door of the main residence, to her booking print at Sybil Brand. They obtain, the following morning, a list from the Spahn Ranch property of every member of your family. They issue, on December 1st, 1969, the largest mass arrest warrant in the history of the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. They drive at 5 a.m. to the Inyo County Sheriff's holding facility where you are being held on the auto theft charge. They serve you with the warrant in your cell. You are now charged, along with 5 of your women, with 7 counts of first-degree murder. The trial begins in the Los Angeles County Superior Court on June 15, 1970. You arrive at the first day of the trial with a small X you have personally carved with a sharpened butter knife into your forehead between your eyebrows, declaring yourself, "You will tell the press," an X'd-out human being. The X will, by 1972, be deepened by you into a swastika. The trial lasts 9.5 months. The prosecutor, a 35-year-old deputy district attorney named Vincent Bugliosi, calls more than 200 witnesses. He plays for the jury in his closing argument the entire B-side of the White Album. The jury convicts you on January 25th, 1971, of 7 counts of first-degree murder. You are sentenced to death on April 19th, 1971. The sentence is commuted to life imprisonment in February 1972, when the California Supreme Court abolishes the state's death penalty. You will spend the next 45 years and 4 months at 4 different California state prisons. You will be denied parole 12 times. You will die at the age of 83 at Kern Valley State Prison on November 19, 2017, of cardiac arrest secondary to colon cancer. This was your life as Charles Manson, the 5'2" child of an Indianapolis bar booth, the man who built his bottomless cavern out of a Beatles record and a survey map, the man who never, in any of the 9 murders, lifted the knife himself.